So I really had no intentions of making another cutting board. But when I saw this design, I just couldn't resist taking on the challenge of building one myself. So when making this cutting board, you're gonna need 4 different types of wood. I'm gonna use walnut, cherry, maple, and sapelli. To begin this project, I'm gonna take all the wood and make it into more manageable sizes. This is just gonna make everything go a lot smoother in the long run. So for the first steps of using the table saw are gonna be to square up one edge of each board. This is important because it's gonna allow us to cut each piece to the certain length that we need for the board. Making sure that each board is cut square is very important in the process to make sure that this cutting board comes out right. Once you have that squared up edge, you're gonna take that edge and line it up with your fence. This is gonna allow you to cut each board to a certain length. So the reason we have to use 4 different types of wood is because each type of wood has its own unique color. Some of them being lighter and some of them being darker is going to look like things are farther in the background or closer in the foreground. I'm not really sure how it all works, but I know when you put these 4 colors together, we're going to hopefully get that 3D look. So for this cutting board, we're going to cut everything down to 13 inches. So once we have all our 13-inch pieces cut, we're going to take them back to the saw and we're going to rip them down to an arbitrary number again. Again, this number really means nothing. It's all about your comfort and how you decide to cut these angles out. So the reason I'm cutting everything to 13 inches is because my form is 13 inches. Plus, cutting these angles on anything longer than 13 inches can kind of be tricky. So if you decide you want to make this cutting board going forward, just know that these numbers are really kind of arbitrary and they don't really mean anything. It's all going to be about how comfortable you are cutting these angles and how big your form is. I know it sounds kind of crazy that none of these numbers really mean anything right now, but you'll see later on in the video as to why that is. So with this arbitrary number in mind, we're going to take it and we're going to cut out 6 identical size pieces out of cherry, maple, and walnut. So once we have our 6 identical pieces at our first arbitrary number, we're going to cut 6 identical pieces at another arbitrary number. So with all of our boards cut, we're going to move on to cutting our first angle on all these pieces. This cutting board being made out of triangles, we have to set our angle to 60 degrees. So for this first pass, we're just going to take one side and we're going to rip it down on that 60-degree angle. So we're going to repeat this angle on each board that we just cut. One side, one angle. Remember how I mentioned at the beginning that these numbers weren't important? Well, now the numbers are important. So before we cut that second angle on each one of these boards, I'm going to take the time and I'm going to make some test cuts to make sure that these boards are to the correct size. So once I have the fence set to the desired size, we're just going to move on and we're going to cut that second angle. So with the first 6 boards all cut to the desired size, we're going to move on to making some test cuts for our next desired size. So once we have our last set of pieces cut to their desired size, we're going to move on to cutting a single triangle itself, which is out of sapelli. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I'm really geeking out about how these triangles came out. When you're using a table saw, you cut out squares. So to see a new shape, it's really exciting for me. So after making all these cuts, you should have 6 walnut, maple, and cherry trapezoids that are roughly 3.5 inches wide. And then you should have 2 walnut, maple, and cherry trapezoids that are roughly 1.5 inches wide. Then you should have 6 sapelli triangles. As important as it was to make sure that these pieces were cut to the desired size, gluing them up is just as important. If you mess up the glue up, then the whole design doesn't work. So no pressure. So a little pro tip here so you don't botch this part of the process up. Have a picture close by so you can reference it if you need it. Because if you mess this up, then the whole project is pretty much scrap after that. You can never have enough glue. Make sure every piece is covered. So gluing up a triangle poses its own challenges. In order to glue a triangle, I had to make my own form to hold all the pieces in its shape. And then once all the pieces were in the shape, then I added the clamps to add the pressure to squeeze it all together. So after waiting a day for the glue to dry, we're going to take each triangle over to the joiner and we're going to take off as little as we can so we can keep each triangle as close to the same shape as possible. And then just repeat the process on all 6 triangles. I'm going to cut these pucks to 1.5 inches. This is one of those numbers that is completely up to you. I want my cutting board to be 1.5 inches thick. You can have your cutting board be 2 inches. You can have it be 1 inch. It's really up to you. So once you determine the thickness of your cutting board, we're just going to repeat this process for all 6 of these triangles. So with all of our pucks cut, we're going to move on to setting up the actual design. Again, make sure you have a picture close by for reference. It's going to make your life a lot easier and it's going to prevent you from messing this cutting board up. So now to turn this goofy shaped cutting board into a square, we're going to take 4 of the triangles, we're going to cut them in half and take 1/2 and put it on the other side of the board to finish off this square. Once you have the 4 triangles marked, we're going to take them over to the bandsaw and we're just going to make a quick cut right down the center. And these will be the pieces for the flip side of that cutting board. At this point in the process, if you're looking at the cutting board from an angle, you're going to start to see that 3D effect. So I know I sound like a broken record telling you to reference this picture and make sure that everything's in order. So to help out with that, we're going to put a link to a picture of this cutting board in the description below. That's going to help you in your process while making this board. This step in the process is taking these triangle pucks and gluing them up into a more usable shape. This is my approach to doing it. I'm sure that there's plenty of different ways that other people would go to glue this together. This seemed like the simplest way when I was deciding on how I was going to clamp this cutting board together. Poof! And then just like that, another day has passed and the glue is dried. We're going to go back to the joiner. We're going to take off as little as possible to keep them as close to the same shape. This is going to ensure that we have a proper glue up on the next step. Once all the edges have been jointed, we're going to go back and we're going to glue all these pieces together. When gluing up any big flat project, you want to make sure you have clamps on the top and the bottom. This is going to prevent the boards from warping and flexing and popping out of the clamps. After the glue's been dried, I moved on to a step that isn't exactly necessary. I went ahead and I flattened out one side of the cutting board just to make the next few steps a little bit easier. To make sure that the cutting board is flat, we're going to use our router planer just to take off the top layer. So if you've stuck around this long in the build, you might as well give this video a like. And hats off to you, because this is a very repetitive build. So with one face of this cutting board flat, we're going to head back to the table saw and square this cutting board up. So for this cutting board, I decided to add a border to it. This kind of just helps with the whole art aspect of this cutting board. With all your pieces cut, we're going to move on and we're going to clamp them up to the cutting board. With the border finished and dried, we're going to move on and we're going to take our router planer and we're going to flatten this cutting board all the way out. With the cutting board all flat, we're going to move on to sanding. I don't know what's more painful, having to sand in the moment or having to go back and watch myself sand in the moment. This is where we're going to see this 3D cutting board come to life. We're going to do that by adding the finish to this cutting board. So if you're looking to make money selling cutting boards, click the video linked on screen. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.